Okay, gentlemen, we're going to talk here about the slave trade, the commerce of people within the transatlantic slave system. This map here is really the transatlantic slave map. You could see regions of origin of slavery there in the green, regions of destination as well. And then there are other slave trade routes that existed, mostly by land, some by sea. However, there's the East African slave trade on the east coast of Africa there. But most we're going to see is really going to come into the forefront of North America and how that breaks down. Really a kind of a system, a complex system that is the extension of kind of the practice of owning people and selling people to others. So this map is actually really important because it does show the movement of slaves throughout this time. So when we look at the slave trade itself, we're talking about a link in the early modern world into a global network of exchange. It's known as the transatlantic slave system that existed, ending human representation. Hey, here. So between the dates of really 1500 and 1866, the trade in humans begins to take a huge boom here. An estimated 12.5 million people from African societies will be shipped really across the Atlantic in what is known as the infamous Middle Passage of the triangular trade. About 10.7 million are going to be deposited into the Americas themselves, where they live out their usually kind of brief lives as slaves. About 1.8 million people will perish in the process of capture and or transport to the African coast as well as dying in the Middle Passage, the slave route that existed. The transatlantic slave system is going to reform a lot of different societies. Africa itself, the commerce thoroughly disrupts a lot of societies. It strengthens others. It corrupts many of those places as well. And it often enriches them with the enslaved Africans. In the Americas, it adds to a new network of people, a mix of European and Native American peoples within this. And the African diaspora, which was the global spread of African people, injects into those societies. It will introduce a lot of different things, one of those being religion, music, artistic traditions, different cuisines as well, into the makings of the American culture. So there is profit for some as far as labor goes, and it enriches the European and Euro-American societies, even though it produces the radical idea behind racial stereotypes. Slavery becomes really a metaphor, too, of many kinds of social oppression. It's very different from the plantation slavery in the centuries that follow. Workers will protest slavery of wage labor. Colonized people reject slavery as imperial domination. And then feminists sometimes define patriarchy as the form of slavery. So now looking at the slave trade in context, African slavery and slavery is not anything new. Most human societies have either had slaves or practiced it in some way, shape, or form. African slavery, we have different types. You had people who were practicing and selling slave for centuries prior to this. You have the trans-Saharan trade that took slaves to the Mediterranean world. There's an East African slave trade as well began in the 7th century, And then there's an Islamic slave trade as well that results in many Africans living outside of the continent that we know it to be. So it's not necessarily something that is new in this shape. Not necessarily right, but not new. Slavery is also going to come in many forms, and it depends really on the region and the time period. In the Indian Ocean, for example, African slaves are often assimilated into the societies from their owners, and they lose a sense of distinct identity that they had that was so prominent within North America. In some places, you'll see that children of slaves are sometimes free and sometimes they're slaves. It just kind of depends on the status of their parents. In the Islamic world, they would prefer female slaves and slaves for domestic work. The Atlantic slave system would definitely rather have male slaves for the plantation work. So definitely differences in the historical portion of slavery there. Not all slaves, though, had lowly positions. Within the Islamic world, many slaves had military or political status as well. But most slaves in the pre-modern world worked in their owner's house. They would have farms or shops they'd be working in, with smaller numbers laboring in large-scale agricultural and industrial societies there. The slave system that emerges within the Americas is very different. It is distinctly American when we look at it. The scale of the importance of the American slave system was enormous. The size of that system and the centrality to the American economy is what is the biggest portion of this. The slave status throughout the Americas was inherited across generations, and there's very little hope of eventual freedom for really what was the mass majority there. It's largely based on plantation agriculture as well. Widespread slavery in a society that valued human freedom and equality, though. It's unlike anywhere else except maybe ancient Greece. So when we look at it, the America preaches equality in those realms, but the human freedom it is very much racial. It is not deemed something that is surrounding. The origins of the Atlantic slavery lay in the Mediterranean, really, and with the sugar plantations. Up until the Crusades, Europeans knew really nothing of sugar and relied on honey and fruits to kind of sweeten what was their bland diets. But as they learned from the Arabs about sugarcane and the laborious techniques for producing usable sugar, Europeans would establish sugar producing plantations within the Mediterranean and just off the coast of West Africa as well. And those are the places where we start to see this start taking place. The work itself is actually very dangerous and difficult to do. There's limits of serf labor and the absence of wage workers. So slavery really becomes ideal within the origins of it. Up until Constantinople fell, Slavs from the Black Sea region provided the most slaves for the Mediterranean sugar plantation. But the Portuguese will find the alternative slave source in West Africa with their arrival and starting to build the sugar plantations there. The Africans will become the primary source of slave labor in the Americas. Because Slavs are not available, that is one of the reasons, but there's also papal permission that is given in 1452. He formally granted the kings of Spain and Portugal full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens, Muslims, and pagans and any other unbelievers to reduce the persons in perpetual slavery. Indians, we also know, Native Americans die from European diseases, so it makes them more of a poorer choice when we look at in terms of slave ideals. This is an 18th century image of a slave occupying her upper class Turkish owner to the public baths. It's really the height of the slave trade in the Ottoman and Indian Ocean worlds. And it really serves as a reminder that slavery was not limited to the Atlantic world in the modern era. But unlike in the Americas, most slaves in North Africa and North and Southwest Asia, excuse me, serve as domestic servants. Female slaves are generally going to be preferred over the males. Okay, the slave trade in practice. Um, the slave trade is really going to be driven by European demand. It's clearly the chief cause of what we know as the tragic commerce. Um, and from the point of sale on the African coast to the massive use of slave labor within the American plantations, the entire enterprise is going to be within the hands of Europeans. Within Africa itself, though, there is a little bit of a different picture that emerges kind of over the centuries. The Atlantic slave trade, as Europeans kind of demand elicited an African supply, the slave trade quickly comes to really operate largely with Europeans kind of waiting on the coast. So it's really from capture to sale, it's in the African hands. So we see that even though there's European demands, they aren't the ones going out and actually capturing slaves. It's really coming from the Africans. Africans will then receive trade goods in return. That might include firearms, often bought kind of with American silver. And then the harrowing journey from the slave to the coast and out of country is what we start to see. We know that the pace of this is also going to pick up as well. During the 16th century, there's actually fewer than 3,000 slaves that were shipped annually. All right. During 1700 to 1850 is really the high point of this sale. Reasoning behind this high point is really going to be the plantation economies within the Americas booming, and they need those portions there. When we look at the actual slave trade and who was enslaved, we're looking at people from West and South Central Africa, right, as being a big part of that. Mauritania in the north and Angola in the south were really big places in which this happens. Initially, it focused more on coastal regions, and then the slave trading kind of progressively moves itself into the interior as the demand for slavery kind of increases. Most of these groups are going to be marginal, meaning they are groups that don't necessarily aren't thought of as important. So marginal groups, generally kind of prisoners of war, anybody who might have been a debtor, people who had been pawned during the times that were difficult, criminals are all going to be those that are going to be sold into slavery. And it's really divided into hundreds of separate and usually small scale communities. Okay. Various peoples of West Africa had no concept of an African identity. So those who they actually captured and sold were normally going to be outsiders of this as well. The vast majority of slaves are going to end up really in Brazil and the Caribbean. Those are the two largest areas in where slave labor demands for the plantation economy existed. Smaller numbers would find themselves within North America, mainland Spanish America, or in Europe. And their journey across the Atlantic is going to be horrendous. About 15% of those who were enslaved died during this middle passage. And the middle passage is located the second leg of what is known as the triangular trade, usually going from Europe to Africa, Africa to the Americas, and then Americas back to Europe. So that three-way system, they became known as the middle passage in this. There is some various forms of resistance that does exist here. They would resist their fates in many ways. About 10% of the transatlantic voyages experienced major rebellion by captives, and resistance continued within the Americas. It has a range of different forms that existed with this. Slow work, okay, working very slowly, to outright rebellion that comes from this. One of those acts was to flee. Many who would escape free communities or former slaves, known as maroon societies. This happens several times, and those found in usually remote regions, especially in South America and in the Caribbean. The largest settlement that had existed was the Palmeiras in Brazil, that had about 10,000 people within there in the 17th century. More people or more people mostly of African descent, but also including Native Americans, mestizos, and small scale groups in there. Usually, if captured, there is they're usually crushed with usually great brutality. Um, Only the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s was a full scale result that brought lasting freedom for its participation there. So we don't necessarily see the popularity of this happening well and ending up well for these groups. This is a watercolor by Lieutenant Francis Meynell of the British Royal Navy. Um, it shows a painting of slaves held below decks on a Spanish slave ship. It illustrates kind of the horrendous conditions of the Atlantic voyage. Most of the time, these groups of people were crammed into small spaces, as many as they could, and they were forced to live in this. Very difficult to use the restroom, to even really move or sleep. And so the very difficult living in these ideals becomes one of the biggest problems there. This here kind of shows the rise and decline of the slave trade that existed. Obviously, you can see the numbers there on the bottom, or the dates on the bottom and the numbers on the left-hand side. The number of slaves imported from Africa, and per 25-year period. So each of these is a 25-year period, really reaching its peak between 1776 and 1800. And then you see the diminishing portion of this between 1851 and 1866. Where do they go? These numbers kind of indicate the numbers of slaves that would be disembarked. Mainland North America has about 3.6% of those groups, 389,000. Mainland Spanish America has 4.6%. The Caribbean is the second largest, 4,798,000, and then Brazil becoming the largest, 4,864 people there. So, excuse me, the charts and graphs that frequently show up on an exam, this would be something that you could use to your benefit if you saw it on the exam. So consequences, kind of the impact of the Atlantic slave trade. Number one is it's going to create something called global linkage. Africa becomes a permanent part of an interacting kind of Atlantic world. Millions of its people are now compelled to make their lives in the Americas, where they made an enormous impact, whether it be demographically and economically. Until the 19th century, they outnumbered European immigrants to the Americas by 3 or 4 to 1. West African societies are also going to increasingly connect to an emerging European-centered world economy. And so that process is set in motion. It has a chain of consequences, and it transformed the lives and societies of people on both sides of the Atlantic there. Number one is going to slow down Africa's growth. Okay? It did not produce in Africa the kind of population collapse that occurred within the Americas, but it does slow down their growth. Europe and China and other regions are actually expanding demographically. So beyond the loss of millions of people over 4 centuries, the demand for African slaves produced really an economic stagnation and social disruption within there. Economically, the slave trade is going to stimulate little positive changes in Africa because of those Africans who benefited most from the traffic of people there. They do not basically, the people who are gaining money, to put it easily for you, the people who are gaining money within Africa aren't using that for production purposes. So you're not seeing Africa move forward as far as expansion goes. It also does not generate breakthroughs in agricultural industry, since Europeans didn't increase the demand for Africa's products just as it did for its people there. Socially, the slave trade shaped really a lot of African societies. Right? It fostered moral corruption, such as judicial proceedings are manipulated to generate victims that could be exported. West African legend would tell of cowrie shells, a major currency of the slave trade, growing on corpses of really decomposing slaves, and a symbolic recognition of the corrupting effects of the commerce itself. African women are going to feel the impact of the slave trade in various ways. Beyond those who numbered among its transatlantic victims, far more men, obviously, we know, go than women to the Americas. So labor demands on those women who remained will increase substantially. It led to more polygamous households as well. It led to the increased use of female slaves within West Africa. And a few women benefited by marrying European merchants, with some seigneuries operating their own trading empires as well. So women are definitely going to be a victim of this too. But they do participate and they do gain enterprises in this as well. The kingdom of Dahomey was ruled by a queen mother. In the kingdom of Congo, women held lower administrative portions and will serve on monarch council of advisors. Matamba also would have female rulers as well. There's a powerful Queen Zinga there who guides the state amid complexities of intrigues and various European and African rivalries. The effects of the transatlantic slave system itself, it will differ from place to place. Within the transatlantic slave system, you see many small-scale kinship-based societies that are going to be thoroughly disrupted as well. You'll have some larger kingdoms, for instance, the Congo and Oyo, slowly disintegrate as trading opportunities and firearms enable outliers to kind of come independent. Benin, in the forest area of what is present-day Nigeria, succeeds in limiting the effects of the slave trade until the 1700s. They will diversify their exports and bring firearms and other goods in. They banned the export of male slaves until the 1700s. And only with the decline in the 1700s did Benin re-engage in the slave trade. Dahomey actively participates during this time in the 1700s, but under a royal control. There would be annual slave raids by the army that exists during this time as well. The government soon came to depend on the trade for essential revenues. And the slave trade within Dahomey became the chief business of the state and remained that way really until the 19th century. This is a seigneur of Senegal. Many women, as we know, we said, suffered greatly because of the Atlantic slave trade, but a few grew quite wealthy and powerful. They're known as seigneuries. They marry European merchants and build their own trading networks. They would employ female slaves, and the women in the 18th century French image here is likely a seigneurie depicted as a European slave port of St. Louis in Senegal. This portrait here is of a man named Ayuba. He was actually sent to sell slaves for his father, take several of them about 200 miles away, and he goes to sell them to a Captain Stephen Pike, who did not reach an agreement with him. So he actually travels farther south to trade a number of the slaves for some cows that he knew he could get down there. The problem was is that's out of the safety of his own kind of country, and they are stopped to rest on the journey, and they are seized. Their heads are all shaved and sold as slaves to the very same Captain Pike. Ayub is actually going to get a message out to his father to give him a ransom in exchange for their slaves. But the ship sails before a reply was received. And so he and 168 other slaves, both men and women, are headed for the colony of Maryland, where he arrives. He's sold to a local planter and begins working in the tobacco fields there. This shows a portrait of a mixed racial relationship here. We see a woman of Native American ancestry from India and a man of African Indian descent, as well as a child who is categorized as a loba or a wolf. Comes from a series of paintings created in the 18th century Mexico. In this portrait here, you see a woman, Sophie of Palatinate in Southwest Germany. This portrait shows her wearing a red feather headdress and cape that was originally made by the indigenous peoples from Brazil. Those feathers were worn by indigenous creators and important rituals, such as those of killing captives. And feathers really symbolically transform both their killer and victim into birds. This last portrait here is showing the coffee, entering into the Ottoman Empire around the 16th century from its place of origin within Ethiopia and Yemen. It's going to encounter some serious opposition, partly because it consumed the new social area, generally a coffee house, and people believed it took away from the people going into mosques and becoming that. So it becomes a refuge of Satan here. And really, it was a point to try to stop the spread of coffee in the Ottoman Empire, where it kind of showed a new kind of area of fun, but it does not necessarily go away at any point in time.